This lecture deals with the 1950s and the culture of America in the 1950s, and it's kind of summarized by the 3 C's. Conservatism. For the most of the decade, the Conservative Party, the Republicans, are going to be in control. Complacency, where Americans don't really question things, they just kind of go along with the flow. And contentment, being satisfied, not necessarily happy, but satisfied with where things are. So Truman is going to leave office in the early 1950s. He leaves office after kind of winning the World War II with the dropping of nuclear weapons. He's the founding president of the United Nations. He proposes the Truman Doctrine that will go anywhere communism does. He supports containment and the Marshall Plan. He will also pass what will be known as the GI Bill, which we'll talk about in a little bit, helping American soldiers coming home from World War II. And he's actually going to end segregation in the Army and in the U.S. government. So federally, it is illegal to have segregated facilities. He's going to attempt to do a fair deal, which is kind of a play off the square deal from Theodore Roosevelt and the New Deal from FDR, and they were programs that attempted to improve living conditions at home. He increases the minimum wage. He tries to increase Social Security benefits. He even tries to get free health care for Americans, but that is going to be a failure for him because of what is going on in Korea. He also will pass the Taft-Hartley Act, or it's passed under him, which reduces the strength of unions. So it's kind of a mixed bag at the end of Truman's legacy. So the GI Bill is passed in 1944 as World War II is wrapping up. GI standing for government issue, and referred to the Americans who fought or served in World War II. They were given loans and pensions, so very inexpensive loans to buy houses or start businesses or go to college, and pensions so they would get paid for their service. They were able to buy homes and businesses, and they got very reduced rates on college tuition, so we started to see a big increase in the amount of Americans, especially men, going to college in the 1950s. So as the GI Bill is passed, 4 million American veterans will buy homes, 8 million will attend college. It helps economic growth substantially because a lot of the construction business is grown by building these homes and servicing these homes. A lot of colleges will make a lot of money, and as they get an education, they get better jobs. And we start to see the growth of the suburbs. They kind of started to grow in the 1920s as people were moving out of the cities, but in the 1950s they really start to balloon because of some new technology that allows people to work in a city but live at home. So in the election of 1952, President Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to be elected, and he serves as kind of the symbol of America. He was the commanding officer of D-Day. He was the first supreme commander of the NATO forces, and he's going to be kind of the embodiment of conservative. He is a Republican. He kind of pushes this complacency of just kind of keep your head down and do your work, and then contentment that Americans should be relatively happy. He's looked on as kind of a perfectly fine president, but not necessarily anything that's too expansive. There are some things that he does that are pretty important, but he's not necessarily a modern Republican. He's one of the last Republicans of his generation. Today, he might be more considered a Democrat because of some of his policies. So socially, we see very well-defined gender roles for both men and women. Women, even though they worked in World War II and were gaining jobs and some independence as they did in World War I, there's less of a fight, at least in the beginning of the 1950s, for women to push and get more rights like they did in the 1920s with flappers. So the ideal modern woman was married, cooked and cared for her family, kept herself busy by joining local PTA and leading a group of campfire girls. So the whole idea of the old-fashioned roles of women kind of come back. The man was supposed to be the provider, the protector, and the boss of the home. And he was the man who went out in his suit, worked, and then he expected dinner to be ready when he arrived home. This is what Americans were supposed to be, and this will be influenced by a new technology called television that they will get in the 1950s. So because of some of this, a large home that people were getting, growth of suburbs, school systems grow, people are more likely to have families also because they generally have higher wages. So a British visitor to America in 1958 said, "It seems that to me that every other young wife I see is pregnant." During the height of the baby boom in the mid to late 1950s, there was a baby born every 7 seconds. We increase our technology, so not only are those babies born, but they live to adulthood, which they didn't necessarily do in earlier generations, but people wanted to start families, and we get kind of the modern American family of, husband, wife, and 2 to 3 children as the kind of modern American ideal and the American dream. So again, the GI Bill kind of helps with this baby boom. People are comfortable financially. Medical science improves. We get the polio vaccination, so that disease is eradicated. And a prosperous economy meant parents could have babies sooner and therefore more. So the whole baby industry becomes a large thing. Dr. Benjamin Spock gets into this by writing the Common Sense book of baby and child care. Most of the time this was passed down, obviously, by mothers or parents or grandmothers, but as people are moving away from their families more, you need some advice for how to take care of babies from other sources. So baby books, what to expect when you're expecting, etc., become far more prominent in the 1950s. So because of this massive population boom, and you were kind of supposed to have children, it kind of plays into that complacency thing and conservatism, kind of be one of us, suburban living becomes very prominent. We have Levittown in New York, where William Levitt produces 150 houses per week. Now, obviously, to be able to produce homes that quickly, they all had to be not of different architectural design. They were all the same. So it plays into this whole idea, if you look around your neighborhoods, if they were built in the 1950s or 60s, a lot of the houses look exactly the same. If they're the exact same layout, you can get those houses built pretty quickly. They were relatively inexpensive, about $8,000 to buy one, and about you can pay $60 a month with no down payment and get a home. And the GI Bill will also help a lot of people. But again, the whole idea of everyone having the same house kind of plays into the idea of we're all the same, be complacent, be content with where you are. So through the 1950s and 60s, we see these homes. They're relatively the same. They both had about 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, relatively small by today's standards, but they did what people needed them to do. By 1960, a third of the U.S. population will live in suburbs, and as they get more and more populated, they actually become more urban. Now, today, about half of the world lives in an urban area, and we're getting less and less rural areas as Americans are moving off of farms and out of cities. But you can see in this image, obviously, this idea of everyone having the same house makes it, the homes are very, very similar, and everybody looks the same. If everybody's the same, there's no reason to question. There's no reason to say, why do you have more? And ironically, this is somewhat of a communistic idea of everyone gets the same house. But we don't talk about that because you're complacent, so you don't really ask any questions. So as people have more disposable income, they start buying new technology, including television. So television becomes very prominent in the 1950s, and we start to see these TV shows that really influence what the American family is supposed to look like, what they're supposed to act like, that mom is always dressed very well and has makeup on but is doing all the housework. The kids are all sweet and nice, and dad always wears a suit and reads the newspaper, and he goes to work every day and comes home. Ironically, it's somewhat similar to the 20s, where they tried to create this. They didn't have television to do it. They had radio. But these TVs are also purchased. They could be purchased on financing, where they put a down payment and then pay the rest off. But because of some of the New Deal safety measures, we don't have an issue of people going into massive debt like we did in the 1920s. So there's some similarities, but some major differences as well. So in 1946, there were about 7,000 televisions sold. By 1950, there are over 50 million. The mass audience, we get celebrating American values. We get the first televised version of Superman. It was, in comic books for a long time, but his kind of catchphrase is truth, justice, and the American way. Also, if you notice, Superman at least has red and blue as his colors, and he fights for good and a lot of against evil, kind of playing into the idea of the Cold War, and this is what good is, this is what bad is, playing into that idea of complacency. Don't ask questions. So by the 1950s, TV becomes the center of consumer culture. 1952, TV Guide outsells every other magazine, telling people what shows were on when, but also advertising. TV dinner and microwaves are introduced in the mid-1950s, and it alters America's eating habits for the not so good, actually, because there are obviously lots of preservatives and other things in those. But we're seeing the impact of television on American culture. And we see in television with shows like I Love Lucy or Leave It to Beaver that it shows the perfect American family, that they don't have very serious problems. This is kind of obviously influences Americans to say, okay, we have to be like this and we have to show this off to everyone. It's kind of like what social media does today. People don't post, horrible pictures of themselves. They post the best pictures of themselves and positive messages, making it seem like only positive things are happening, which puts a person who doesn't have positive things happening, in kind of a rough spot, because the perfect family, you're not supposed to question that. That's what you're supposed to be like. And we start to see the Western become very popular. Davy Crockett, Lone Ranger, Gunsmoke, all these, good American cowboys that fight for good and fight evil, kind of instilling that, there is a good and there is an evil, and you don't have to ask questions about it. These are the good guys. Again, that idea of complacency. And with that, we get consumerism. Same idea in the 1920s of keeping up with the Joneses. In 1950, the first credit card is produced, so you can swipe that credit card and pay for things. You got dishwashers and microwaves and different new technology, just like the 1920s, but it was safer because you had generally had a lot better income than in the 1920s. And one of those things that showed you were keeping up with the Joneses was having a family car. In 1945, the car registration was 25 million. By 1960, we're up to 60 million. Most families in the 1950s only had one car, but that two family cars doubles from 51 to 58. So you see a lot of new cars being bought. And a lot of people have like a family car, like a sedan or a station wagon. But they also had a sports car, the motor cars, like a Chevy Corvette, or the pink Cadillac that becomes very synonymous with the 1950s. So you had a play car, and you had like a get-to-work car. The culture of the car shows freedom and allows people to move further away, influencing those suburbs. But again, it was the idea that everybody has a car, that idea of complacency and contentment. So with the new car, people started to move to new areas, especially the Sun Belt in the South and Southwest, Arizona, Nevada, California. And Disneyland will open in 1955, showing that this is where you're supposed to go for vacation. 40% of the guests from Disneyland came from outside California, so you get the idea of the family road trip. And Disneyland shows that Frontierland, American history, Main Street, USA, what it's supposed to look like, and then Tomorrowland, where we are going in the future. So with the culture of the car, we start to have a more homogeneous society. We start to see chain restaurants, one of the first being McDonald's in 1955, Howard Johnson hotels and restaurants, and then drive-in movies that everybody could see the same movies. Everybody could eat at Howard Johnson's, and everybody could eat a Big Mac. So this whole idea of contentment, we're all happy because the food is fast and good, we can get it anywhere, and we're complacent. We don't ask questions about what's in the food necessarily, although it was healthier in the 50s than it is today. So the car allows us to travel and therefore eat less at home, which will influence our health later on. Because of the car, we also invest in highways. There were no interstates before the 1950s. It's the largest American public works project in American history. There's 41,000 miles of new highways built at a cost of about $32 billion. This is an Eisenhower Republican doing this, investing in infrastructure to get America, on the move. This was also because most interstates go through major cities. So if a nuclear attack was going to happen, we needed people to be able to get out quickly. So a lot of people think of it as commerce and things like that, and that's part of it, but it's also because of the fear of nuclear war. So that Cold War is, again, behind everything we do in the 1950s. So as we wrap the 1950s politically, Eisenhower is going to be the one who ends the Korean War. We have a great economy in the 1950s, so he's going to be looked on highly for that. He expands the highway, which aids the growth. He's going to invest in NASA and the space race, and Brown versus Board of Education and Little Rock 9 will happen under his watch as well. We'll talk about that later. And last but not least, something that affects you students very significantly is we get the idea of teen culture. In the 1950s, before the 1950s, the word teenager didn't really exist. But now that parents have a lot of disposable income and kids have a lot of options between rock and roll music and race music like Elvis, 13 million teenagers had $7 billion to spend a year, so people start investing in them. Rock and roll becomes dangerous because it comes from rhythm and blues of African Americans, so we saw how jazz influenced the 20s, rock and roll becomes the music of the 50s. So we also invest a lot in science. You can see all these different impacts that science has through the 1950s, and teenagers will see that in their schools, where science and math become the main focus because we need to build future engineers to combat the Soviets. And this all happens especially because in 1957, the Russians launched their first satellite, Sputnik. And this scares us because it seems like the Russians are winning the space race. We will invest more in the space race in the 1960s, and that wraps up this lecture.